On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we are joined by Dr. Karin Öberg. She is a professor of astronomy at Harvard University with a specialty in astrochemistry. She's an adult convert to the Catholic Church and partly influenced in doing so by reading G.K. Chesterton, and she's going to speak to us a little bit today about the Star of Bethlehem. Stay tuned. Viewers and listeners, welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense. I'm Joe Grabowski, the VP for Evangelization here at the Chesterton Society, joined as always by my wonderful co-host, Grettelyn. Hi, Grettelyn.
Hi there, Joe.
And as I said in the intro, we're very honored to have joining us today Dr. Karin Öberg, who we learned about through various other podcasts. If you tune into a lot of Catholic podcasts, you probably know her already. But Doctor, such a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. As we'll talk about, Chesterton has a special place in my heart. So how could I not want to come and join you?
Wonderful.
Well, as you can imagine, he has a special place in our hearts as well. And we're very much looking forward to that. As I mentioned in the intro for the viewers and listeners, you're receiving this episode right around the Feast of the Epiphany. Spoiler, we are recording this earlier in the season, so if you notice a lack of Christmas decorations behind us on the wall and things, this is why. But you're in the midst of the celebration of Christmastide, and so we will be speaking about that particular Christmas miracle of the Star of Bethlehem later in the podcast. But before we get into that, Karin, why don't you introduce yourself to those of our viewers and listeners who might be unfamiliar, a little bit about your background and specifically your field of study?
Yeah, sure. So as the slightly strange pronunciation of my name, Karin, might suggest, I was not born here, though I did become an American citizen pretty recently. But
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I was born in Sweden into sort of agnostic Lutheran family, so received the initial sacraments, baptism, confirmation in the Lutheran Church. But by the time I was a young teenager, I had pretty much abandoned what kind of sort of childhood faith that I had in God. But I had not really abandoned the idea that there is something immaterial, more from philosophical grounds than from any sort of spiritual ones. And I think that was what kept me away from sort of pure atheism, and what also made me start to wonder as a senior in college whether this is something that I should take more seriously. These are philosophical commitments that I had, and especially to that of free will and to the reality of morals, which both seem to point towards something immaterial.
Wonderful. Well, how did Chesterton sort of influence your eventual return?
Well, he wasn't really part of the initial story, so that honor instead goes to our Anglican friend, C.S. Lewis. So reading Mere Christianity, first a couple other books, but eventually reading Mere Christianity was what brought me into the Christian family. Very sort of dramatic one-day conversion experience in reading that book, entering it as I think an agnostic, which in hindsight, a longing for belief and longing for God. But my experience of the day was that of an intellectual conversion. That was sort of purely in the mind, and only later I think I realized there was also something to the heart. And I entered that day, started reading the book Mere Christianity. By the time I was sort of like 2/3 through of it, I just realized that I was, with the language that I know today, sort of assenting to belief in God, and especially in Jesus as his incarnation here on earth. And I didn't really know that much about how to be Christian, but I did know you're supposed to go to church. So I did find a nearby church. I was then in the Netherlands, so the Anglican church was what seemed the most natural of a fit. But about a year, and I was very happy there. But about a year later, I received Orthodoxy from a family member, not Christian. He thought that if I was going to do this whole Christian thing, I may as well do it right. And so kudos to him. And I started reading Orthodoxy, and I had somewhat of a similar experience as when I read Mere Christianity, in that I clearly assented to what was being shown there. And that it was just obvious to me that not that I was like Chesterton in terms of my Christianity, but that was what I wanted to be. And that he just seemed so reasonable. And I just fell in love with him from the first chapter and read Orthodoxy again in a day or so, which is not something I generally recommend for people to do. But for me, that was definitely the right path. So he's the one who got me from then thinking about Catholicism. And I sort of knew, like 1 year into my Christian journey, that I was going to be Catholic one day. Then it took a few more years to act on it, but he opened the door into becoming Catholic.
Wow, that is amazing. Was he sort of part of, I assume that, the transition from the head to the heart happened somewhere in there. Did he sort of help you kind of bring Christianity into your heart more?
No. I think this is like one of those things when, okay, that's unfair. I think at the time, and I would say for many years, I saw my conversion as an intellectual adventure. I mean, and a wonderful intellectual adventure, but really one of the mind. And it is only in hindsight, I think even if I told this story just like a few years ago, I would describe it as an intellectual journey, as an intellectual conversion. And I think it's only as I have somewhat matured in my faith and sort of look back and can reinterpret what happens, is that you don't have that kind of reaction to either Lewis or Chesterton if your heart is not already longing. I mean, I think that's just impossible. But it was just not clear to me at the time, and it did not really lead me to a lot of personal prayer or other things that you would associate with sort of conversion of the heart. But I think it laid the groundwork for a lot of it, even if it was sort of hidden, even from me, for many years after that sort of initial conversion.
It's remarkable in that I think you do have more of a similarity to Chesterton, maybe even than you know, in that I would say that it was similar to him, that while he was going through it in Orthodoxy, for example, he sort of, he has that sort of somewhat even flippant remark about how he was trying to invent his own form of Christianity, kind of inventing a new novel heresy, and when he finally put the finishing touches on it, he discovered that it was just Orthodoxy. And it is sort of constructed as this intellectual journey. In his later writings, like Conversion of the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church and Conversion, or The Well and the Shallows, very late in life, those apologetics essays, he sort of goes back and revisits the same ethics of Elfland, the same sort of philosophy that he was laying out in Orthodoxy, but now there's a acknowledgement of the integration into it of those deep human longings. You see this in his autobiography, which is his last year of life, when he writes that about his father's toy theater and how that it was already sort of starting to move him in these certain ways. So I think it's a wonderful testament to just sort of the journey that God leads many a convert on, even those that are born Catholic, live lives of conversion like Augustine, finding that their hearts are restless until they come to rest in God. So I do want to pivot, though, and say, I guess you were this entire time a student, at least, of probably physics or chemistry, and looking towards this career. And what is that like? Being a believing Christian. I think our world tends to sometimes see these things as opposed, faith and reason, but obviously not in your case. So maybe speak to a little bit to your field of study and the role it plays in your faith life.
That's right. So I had already my first science degree by the time that I started to consider Christianity seriously. So I had gone to Caltech, so a very science-intense place, got my degree in chemistry, but with a lot of extra physics and astronomy there. And I was pursuing my PhD in astronomy when all these things are taking place. So in that way, I am a scientist before I'm a believer, I guess is the important thing there. To me, it was just never an issue. And I only started to learn and sometimes build up arguments that hopefully other people find compelling of why it's not an issue. Once I was already sometimes fully in the Catholic Church, and I started getting questions about it. Since, as you say, it is something that often in media or even people have thought about it sort of more superficially, will question whether it is actually possible or at least coherent to be both a scientist and a Christian believer. Maybe they think about things like Genesis and evolution, or Genesis and the Big Bang or something like that. So what I study has some philosophical implications. So I think about how stars and planets form, and especially how often you get planets that could sustain life. So think about the origins of life, which maybe is the third thing that people think about as a possible contradiction with the faith. But it was not something that I started to integrate early on. I would say that for a long time, these were two parallel parts of my life. Not things that I thought were in contradiction with one another or sort of threatened one another, but it wasn't really obvious to me how they sort of interact in meaningful ways. And it's only thanks to the encouragement of a lot of other wiser people that I have started to think in the past maybe 5-6 years on how to also have more of a constructive ways of interaction. Though a little bit similar to what we just talked about, I think there were more things hidden that I was already doing in terms of bringing faith commitments into the workplace and how I think about how I do science, and keeping in mind that even as we're trying to get to these wonderful truths about the cosmos, which I think can be a form of prayer in itself, that still the most important things are the people that you're working with, and sort of setting their adventure and exploration even before answering some of those big questions. Now, it turns out that when you do that, you actually get more answers to big questions and more awesome explorations, because that's how people work. So you don't actually have to choose one or the other. But I think I was doing that much earlier than I was doing it consciously. But I think where I'm the most excited now is thinking also a bit more sort of philosophically and theologically, where some of these questions about origins of life, is there life elsewhere, or even why does science work, and think about that both from a theological, philosophical, and scientific point of view.
So I'm not a science person at all, but I do find it interesting. And I have heard that, physics is a lot more sort of philosophical, probably of most of the sciences. And it does seem like physics in some ways naturally points to an immaterial realm. Is that true, would you say?
So I don't know. So I think it's factually true that in some sense physics is friendlier to today, to metaphysics, to religion than some of the more biological sciences. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that is something that is intrinsic to the science. I mean, I think if you go back a couple of 100 years, I'm not sure that you would see that same kind of division. My guess is that it has mostly to do with evolution and sort of the battles over teaching evolution, especially in the US.
Sure.
And that's therefore is sort of seen as a conflict area, and therefore people are more nervous about religious belief if you go into biological sciences. While on the physical sciences, we just don't have that. I mean, the Big Bang was conceived by a Catholic priest. Most people know that. It's just not seen as a risky thing to the sort of the sciences that you are a Christian.
It's funny. It's almost more like a pop science concept, less of like a serious scientist sort of a problem.
Yeah. Just to go back to what you were saying, I mean, I do think that both the physical and biological sciences, in some sense, naturally moves you towards metaphysics for different reasons. I think thinking about the cosmos, especially in the era of Big Bang cosmology, where sort of science is giving you a vision or an icon of a beginning, it is much harder to not think about where it came from and to start. And I think then if you do that, you are sort of in a risky territory if you want to stay a pure sort of materialist. And I think in the biology portion of it, if you take biology and especially the human person seriously, and what we can do, what we mean about truth, I think it's also risky to do that if you want to stay a pure materialist atheist.
Yeah, it's the sort of Chesterton's argument in The Everlasting Man that human beings are different in kind and not in degree. Like we're just so different from our animal, cousins or whatever you want to call them. But it's just a different thing altogether, and sort of points towards a grander design, I guess. Wow.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Well, yeah, I think of, so many Chestertonian connections here about how, the in orthodoxy, for example, he says, that the world does not explain itself. There's this invitation into meditation, and he says that he finds it to be magical. And I think that there's a tendency, we've spoken a little bit about sort of this popular conception of science and reason being opposed, or reason and faith being opposed. I think part of that comes from the four horsemen of the new atheism, Richard Dawkins in particular. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So they, of course, have created this kind of pop culture image where even Chesterton says in places that a lot of scientists are actually people of deep faith because it leads them there. I guess this is sort of a question out of left field, but what is most exciting for you from like being a person of faith doing this cutting edge research, and we really are. I mean, with the James Webb Telescope and new, so many new countries launching probes and things out into the solar system. What most excites you as a person of faith doing this work about the horizons of what we have to discover and learn about our universe, and why? Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely right. I think in multiple sort of places, we're getting, it seems like we're getting closer to actually being able to answer some of these big origins questions. Now, I think there are two kinds of origins questions, one that is open to science and one that's not, just sort of in principle. And then I think there are some that are maybe debated. So if you take sort of, in some sense, the most exciting ones are the origins of the universe and the origins of the human person. Those have a physical and material component to it, but they also have a creation out of nothing component to it that is not open to science. And then you have things like planets, where I think we have made really sort of wonderful advances in understanding how they happen. And then you have the one that I think is the most exciting, or just from a both scientific and philosophical point of view, which is that of origins of life. And I would say that's the one that's a little bit contested, especially if you talk to people of faith that might have a generally positive view of science, that for a combination, I would say, of scientific, philosophical, and sometimes theological reasons, think that this is not something that happened naturally. I think it probably did. I think there have been some exciting scientific advances that points toward that this is something that could happen naturally, even though we're far from figuring it out. If that turns out to be the case, that you do get origins of life, so chemistry turning into biology, if you pretty much just have conditions that are similar to what we had on the young Earth,
that is telling us something really exciting about how the laws of nature are ordered in this universe, and how in some sense chemistry is like pointing towards biology in some really fundamental, beautiful way. So I guess my main message is that if you are a Christian, scientists have not told us yet whether origins of life happen naturally. But if it did happen naturally, that is telling us that we live in a mysteriously well-ordered universe, like even sort of deeper than we currently know. So I don't think there are any sort of bad theological consequences coming out of that. But so we're trying to figure that out here on Earth, how origins of life could have happened, and whether so this chemistry leads to biology naturally. And at the same time, we are at the cusp of being able to investigate what other planets, what exoplanets are like that we think are similar to Earth in some important ways. So with the James Webb Space Telescope, we're getting this beautiful data of larger planets. So think about things that are a bit smaller than Neptune up to bigger than Jupiter. So we're figuring out what they are like. But most people think that the likelihood of having life on any of those planets is very small, even if we typically get life on Earth-like planets. And we just need a slightly better telescope. So even if James Webb is awesome, it's not awesome enough to start really accessing these smaller planets where we think that if there is life, if life is widespread in the universe, we should start seeing some signs of it. And that would also, I think, be a good sign that origins of life happens through natural means. Now, my theological reason why I think this is true is that just seems to be the way that God governs the universe, is through secondary causes, that he wants creation to be part instead of unfolding itself and is supposed to take part in his creation. That just seems the way that he likes it. Like he gave us free will so he could sort of providentially govern us through our free will, which I think is the most clear sign that he likes a creation that really takes part in its own unfolding.
Beautiful. I love that idea that, even if life could happen naturally from chemistry, biological life, that it just points towards a more interesting designer, like this, it's a cool idea, and it makes a lot of sense to me as a Christian, but just it's I don't know. It does make sense that if God wants to do it this way, he can, right? He can do anything. So, and 1,000 ages in his sight is a day. So like he can do what he wants. And yeah, it's amazing.
I think to Chesterton again, and this is just I understand the tendency for some Christians or people of faith to almost feel overwhelmed by this, and almost, and Chesterton talks about this in a few places, where looking up at the vast expanse of the universe in the sky, it can make us feel very tiny, and it can seem to overwhelm us with this sense of futility. And yet he reverses that, and he says he thinks of the universe as something cozy and small and kind of appropriated to us. And that is literally the case when you think, for me, it just leads to larger wonder when I go out, as I was the other day, just a few miles from here, and the number of stars visible in the sky compared to what I get to see on my back deck because of the light pollution of the city was just vastly more. And I could look up and I could see these stars, and to think that starlight billions of years old is now coming into my retina and being perceived. And now with the James Webb Telescope, that's just sort of like in Chesterton's coziness model. It's like putting on a pair of glasses, and now you can see further. You can see starlight from the beginning, close to the beginning of the universe, or as close in time to the beginning of the universe as we've ever seen. That's a remarkable fact, and I think that it should lead to greater wonder, and realize that the same God who can create each one of us and make us wonderfully and fearfully has maybe created all of this too, simply so that we would have the pleasure of its enjoyment, if nothing else, right? So
yeah, no, so 3, I guess, rapid thoughts about things that I love about Chesterton, at least 2 of them, and then maybe one class. So I think this about sort of the cozy universe is a really important one. Like he talks about how for things we love, whether it's people or things, we use the diminutive. Mm-hmm. And I think that is absolutely right. And I wonder, and this is pure speculation, but we live in a world where I think the universe seems darker and more distant and more something overwhelming than it should, because when we look up on the sky, we tend to see just darkness because of light pollution. I think if you go out where it is truly dark and you see all of the stars, I mean, it almost brings it closer. Because it's no longer just this vast expanse of darkness, but it's something beautiful. And I am sort of torn. It depends which day you ask me on whether there is life out there, which actually most days I think there is. But I also don't think it's inconceivable that this whole universe was just made for our pleasure. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if we're talking about a God who stepped into creation to become a baby to save us, I mean, that is truly like inconceivable in some sense. Mm-hmm. Making a very big universe for us to enjoy, I mean, that's much less than actually stepping into it, becoming part of it in some sense, and dying for it. I do think one of the reasons, though, why it's sometimes good to just take a step back and be a little bit overwhelmed by the universe is that also, again, makes the incarnation like sort of clearer what kind of dramatic gift it is. Mm. That it is the creator of that whole overwhelming universe that became a baby. I mean, that is my sort of go-to imagery when I'm feeling, I don't know, jaded or not not grateful enough. I think sort of two other quick things where I think Chesterton ties in very well with the life of the scientist. One is his sort of insistence of this sort of faith and reason, that they are not in conflict, and that actually, if you dig all the way down with reason, at the very bottom you find a faith commitment. If nothing else, then that your reason works. And that is not something that you can take for granted if you have a purely materialistic kind of worldview. And I think he's so right about that. But then the final one, I think, sort of in hindsight, what really attracted me to Chesterton is that he managed to combine this, I think, intense sense of gratitude and wonder about the universe, and at the same time not take it too seriously. And I think that is also the Christian paradox. And that is just something that on good days, I think I manage to mirror a little bit. And on the other days, I aspire to. That is living in that tension between just wondering gratitude on the one hand, and then kind of laughing at it a bit, that we are somewhat ridiculous creatures in a somewhat ridiculous universe. And that is also okay.
I love that. It makes me think, I think there's a passage in Chesterton, maybe it's just a conglomerate of Chestertonian thought that, and I don't think it's incompatible with the idea that there's life out there other than us too, is that, this universe is so beautiful. Everything is so beautiful that there's color, there's light, there's all these things. And Chesterton says, the grass could not have been green. We could have basically lived in a black and white, boring world. And just this idea that everything, in a sense, is like a love note from God, It's this like shouting of, I love you so much. And the stars are such a beautiful illustration of that. I have had the privilege of, at Chesapeake Bay, a few years at summer camp when I was a kid, just seeing that amazing blanket of stars when there's just so many. And it does have a feeling of closeness. I never thought of it that way, but it does seem closer when there are more of them. That's amazing. But maybe we could pivot a little and talk a little bit about the Star of Bethlehem before we have to sign off here. Would love to hear a real physicist's, astronomer's take on this and how this worked and how it came about.
Yeah, so I think there's two camps, right, of what the Star of Bethlehem was, and then there's the middle one, which unsurprisingly I'm going to be falling into. But let me just lay out where I think the two things you hear most of the time. One is that this was a true astronomical phenomenon of some sort. So maybe it was a supernovae, a conjunction of two planets, maybe a comet, but there was something real that happened among the stars. And because of God's providential care of nature, that became interpreted by the wise men or the kings of the East as a way to find their way to Judea and eventually to Bethlehem. The other option is that what we're talking about is not a natural phenomena, but it is a supernatural light, either visible to them or visible sort of internally, spiritually, that guides them, again, on their spiritual journey out of sort of a pagan country into Judea and eventually to Jesus. And there are sort of pros and cons with both, right? If you're thinking about both how the story is portrayed as well as, I think, theological significance. I think it's very attractive to imagine or interpret at least the initial sort of observation of a star in the sky as a natural phenomenon. Again, it seems like that is most of the time how God wakes us up. It is not through something that's obviously miraculous, but it is by using sort of people of good faith, trying to work things out in their sort of familiar or professional lives and sort of helping them to see or like draw our attention to something. So to me, it just makes sense that you have these men who are faithfully studying the stars, trying to understand how, things here on Earth by studying the stars, that their initial observation would be of something real, like something material in the sky that would sort of wake them up. Now, astronomically, it's very difficult to have that be the only thing that's going on. That's just like a star is very far away. Having a star sort of be right on top of Jerusalem versus Bethlehem versus Nazareth, depending on how you interpret where they're living at the time. That's just not how astronomical observations work, especially in ancient times. Thomas Aquinas writes about this beautifully, that, well, if this is going to work, the star would have to be really close to the surface, or you would not be able to tell if it's sort of on top of the Mary's and Joseph's house versus somewhere else. So my sort of gloss on it would be that, yeah, God used their profession, their sort of faithful observations of the heavens to give them that sort of material or like this natural sign to get them thinking, to wake them up, to sort of launch them on this journey. But even there, you would need that infusion of grace to actually interpret what you're seeing in the heavens, and to will to travel, to set out and travel towards Judea. But to actually complete the journey, to go from Jerusalem to Mary's and Joseph's house to meet Jesus, at that point, I think an angelic messenger or a sort of more spiritual, like directly spiritual kind of sign is going to be necessary. You are not going to be at natural reason or the sort of the light of reason. That's not going to get you all the way. It's going to get you started. But to actually get over the threshold into Mary's and Joseph's house, you're going to need a direct spiritual intervention.
I love that. That's a very, I think that's a beautiful articulation of how God does tend to work. Because like you said, I think he usually works through just nature, right? But occasionally we do know that there are these kind of like catastrophic moments where he sort of like shoots a message to people or whatever. And that's very interesting. I've never heard this take before. Thank you. It's very interesting.
Well, and I loved the sort of trajectory you described there, because it's almost a parable, as it were, of the Christian life, that and the way that grace builds upon nature, that nature will take you so far, but to use your words, to cross that threshold, to go into the home of the Holy Family, you're going to maybe need a bit more than just what nature can do. You will definitely need more, right? It needs grace. So I'm going to ask, sort of for the benefit of our listeners, because I imagine, the comm boxes sometimes, and I think of what somebody could be thinking. And just to clarify, when you describe the unlikelihood, and I track with this, I follow, of sort of the alignment of a star being identifiably from a perspective, above this place versus that place, would the same be true of a planet, or could there be a possible distinction there?
No, so I guess there's a couple of things to try to tease out. One is, what do you mean with a star being on top of anything here on Earth? Because if you've been out in the night, you will see that the stars seem to move during, which is obviously due to us moving rather than them. But even if you just want to have the appearances of a star being aligned with some place here on Earth, it's going to have to be at a specific time. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that it's at some well sort of understood, maybe it's at midnight, or there's some specific significant time when you see a star on top of something here on Earth. But the precision with which you can do that depends on the precision at which you can see the stars in the sky. And even for something like a planet, they're just like way too far away to make a distinction, I would say, with neighboring cities and definitely neighboring houses.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's for me no less wondrous, because I'm reminded of a quotation, and unfortunately I can't remember who said it, and I'm going to have to paraphrase, but it might have been C.S. Lewis in his work on miracles, but the idea was that there are those that object to miracles using, by saying, well, this could be caused this or that natural way. And they used the metaphor of Balaam's ass, and they said, donkeys exist and language exists. It is rather in the conjunction of the two that we find something remarkable taking place. And I think that it could be the case that when we read in Matthew and it says the star, they followed it until it came and it stood over the place, that in they arrive at a place where now in that perspective they first see maybe the home, and then they look above and the star is there, and that's their I think that even just an exegetical reading of the passage allows for all kinds of manners in which God could be leading them, and that there's again this combination of grace and nature, that maybe it's natural observation, but it's the interpretation of the events from our perspective, and all that harkens back to what we said earlier about how there's a coziness, the way that God sometimes appropriates things to us, this vast universe, that it is remarkable to think that if it were really a star, if it is really a star, and we know where stars come from, that could have been there all that time for that purpose, for that moment, for however that operated, that even that was part of this plan. It's just it's a remarkable thing to consider.
Absolutely.
Well, any final thoughts, Karin? We've gone a bit long, but first of all, thank you so much. I'm sure that our viewers and listeners will get a great deal of joy out of this as they celebrate this great feast of the Epiphany. But any final thoughts to leave the audience with?
I think ending at the star with the star seems like an appropriate place to end, given both the season as well as the profession that I have found myself in. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, and how about you, Grettelyn? Any closing thoughts for today?
No, I think that's wonderful. I just, again, we appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, indeed. And, I'll end with my own personal thought. Just the last thing I end with, the star being as wonderful as it is, but that wonderful Chestertonian line that haunts me every year at this time, that the hands that made the stars could not even reach the heads of the cattle. And that image is where we find such peace and joy during this season. And I hope that peace and joy is reigning within your homes, dear listeners. And that you're continuing to celebrate that event, because we shouldn't let that easily go away. We should follow that star with vigor and celebrate as best we can. So to all of you, again, blessings in this season. Merry Christmas. Continue to celebrate and lay your gifts before the King. And we will see you again next week. Please, in the meantime, like, subscribe, hit the bell to get notifications, leave us a comment down in the comment box about what you thought of this episode. And please share this with a friend, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Until next time, God bless, and again, Merry Christmas.